From New York, the epicenter of the pandemic, this is Democracy Now!
We're going to put a hold on money spent to the WHO. We're going to put a very powerful hold on it, and we're going to see.
As the confirmed cases of coronavirus surpass 2 million around the world, President Donald Trump says he's cutting U.S. support for the World Health Organization. One science leader called it a crime against humanity. We'll get response from the head of Oxfam America and how this could impact international cooperation critical to saving lives around the world. And we'll look at their new report that estimates the pandemic's economic fallout could push more than 600 billion more people into poverty. Then, the coronavirus in Indian country. The Navajo Nation's reporting nearly 30 deaths and more than 830 confirmed cases.
It's just shedding light on the disparities that have already existed and also the lack of federal funding to meet the demand of the health needs.
And we'll go to Miami, Florida, to speak with an African-American doctor who was handcuffed and detained outside his home Friday as he was wearing a surgical mask and preparing for a volunteer shift to test homeless people for COVID-19. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Donald Trump said Tuesday he would cut off U.S. support for the World Health Organization even as the death rate from the coronavirus pandemic continues to accelerate, with worldwide confirmed deaths topping 127,000. Speaking from the Rose Garden, Trump sought to shift blame for his administration's disastrous handling of the pandemic onto the United Nations Public Health Agency, accusing the WHO of helping China to cover up the spread of the coronavirus when it emerged late last year.
The world depends on the WHO to work with countries to ensure that accurate information about international health threats is shared in a timely manner. And if it's not, to independently tell the world the truth about what is happening. The WHO failed in this basic duty and must be held accountable.
Trump's decision sparked international outrage and condemnation. Richard Horton, editor-in-chief of The Lancet Medical Journal, tweeted, President Trump's decision to defund the WHO is simply this, a crime against humanity. Every scientist, every health worker, every citizen must resist and rebel against this appalling betrayal of global solidarity, he said. The United States reported 2,228 people died of COVID-19 Tuesday, the highest one-day death toll for any nation in the world. Here in New York, city officials have revised the death toll since the start of the pandemic to more than 10,000, adding in nearly 4,000 previously unreported deaths presumed to be caused by the coronavirus. About 1 in 800 New York City residents has died of the disease. On Tuesday, New York City's Metropolitan Transportation Authority agreed to a union demand for COVID-19 death benefits. Beneficiaries of transit workers who die of the virus will receive $500,000 and 3 years' worth of health care benefits. At least 59 New York City subway and bus workers have died of COVID-19 so far, with more than 2,200 testing positive. New Jersey reported 365 coronavirus deaths Tuesday, a record daily toll for the nation's second most impacted state. New Jersey's health commissioner says 324 of the state's 375 nursing homes have confirmed cases of COVID-19.
We're making the assumption that COVID-19 is in most, if not all, of our nursing homes at this point.
Nationwide, more than 3,800 people have died at long-term care facilities, about 15% of all U.S. deaths. In California, Governor Gavin Newsom Tuesday outlined a roadmap to eventually reopen parts of the economy in tandem with Oregon and Washington state. Governor Newsom's plan calls for greatly expanded testing, tracing the contacts of people who test positive, and isolating those exposed to the virus. It would also expand protections for seniors and other vulnerable groups while ensuring that hospitals don't get overwhelmed by surges of COVID-19 patients. Schools would develop new protocols for keeping students physically separated, and restaurants would be required to provide strong safety measures.
You may be having dinner with a waiter wearing gloves, maybe a face mask, dinner where the menu is disposable, where the tables, half of the tables in that restaurant no longer appear, where your temperature is checked before you walk in to the establishment. These are likely scenarios.
In Florida, Republican Governor Ron DeSantis is defending his administration's decision to classify professional wrestling events as essential services during the lockdown. World Wrestling Entertainment resumed live matches without audiences Monday. The governor has repeatedly defied calls by local officials to take stronger action to slow the spread of coronavirus. On Monday, Florida Surgeon General Dr. Scott Rifkes was removed from a press briefing after he said social distancing measures might need to remain in place for a year or longer.
So as long as we're going to have COVID in the environment, and this is a tough virus, we're going to have to practice these measures so that we are all protected.
Just moments after these remarks, Dr. Rifkes was ushered out of the room by Governor DeSantis' spokesperson. Governor DeSantis is a close ally of President Trump. A budget watchdog warned Tuesday the federal budget deficit would rise by a record-smashing $3.8 trillion this year, even if lawmakers don't pass any more stimulus bills, which they're widely expected to do. Deficit spending is on track to top 18.7% of the U.S. gross domestic product, the highest rate since World War II. Today, April 15th, is typically tax day, but the IRS has extended the deadline for income tax filings until July 15th. The Treasury Department says more than 80 million people who've authorized the IRS to make a direct deposit on a recent tax return will see stimulus payments of up to $1,200 added to their bank accounts. Others will have to wait for a check. In an unprecedented move, President Trump has ordered the Treasury to print his name on all stimulus checks. Senior IRS officials told the Washington Post the request could slow delivery of the checks by a few days. In more economic news, the International Monetary Fund warned Tuesday the coronavirus pandemic will spark the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The IMF said global economic output could contract by 3% this year. It originally predicted the 3.3% rate of growth for 2020. In India, press freedom and civil liberties groups are sounding the alarm that the government of Narendra Modi is using the coronavirus outbreak to crack down on opponents and dissidents. Earlier this month, police arrested prominent journalist Siddharth Vardarajan, accusing him of spreading discord and rumors after he reportedly criticized a Hindu nationalist politician for participating in a religious ceremony with dozens of people during the national lockdown. Elsewhere, activists Anand Teltumde and journalist Gautam Nalaka were arrested Tuesday over charges that both say were fabricated. Prime Minister Modi has announced India's nationwide coronavirus lockdown affecting 1.3 billion people will be extended until May. In Mumbai, hundreds of migrant workers left homeless and unemployed by the lockdown held a protest Tuesday, demanding the government deliver food and assistance.
We are not getting anything here. The government promised to provide money and other amenities, but nothing has been delivered yet.
We have nothing to do now. We have small kids and they are not getting anything to eat. What should we do?
In Japan, a team of medical experts predicts 400,000 people could die from COVID-19 in Japan unless strong measures are taken to stop the spread of the disease. The findings commissioned by Japan's health ministry come as Japan still has no stringent lockdown measures in place. Last week, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe declared a state of emergency and asked citizens to voluntarily maintain social distancing, though many retail outlets remain open. Japan has confirmed more than 8,000 cases and 162 deaths from COVID-19. British officials said Tuesday the rate of COVID-19 deaths may be 10% higher than official reports, adding to evidence that European nations have been significantly undercounting the true toll of the virus. This comes as some hard-hit European countries have begun reopening some businesses. In Italy, which recorded its smallest number of new coronavirus cases in a month, some bookstores and children's clothing shops have reopened. In parts of Spain, some construction and factory workers are back on the job. Meanwhile, Meanwhile, German health officials said 285 people died of coronavirus-related symptoms Tuesday, the highest daily death toll in Germany so far. Turkey's parliament voted Tuesday to temporarily free 45,000 prisoners, about a third of its prison population, to limit the spread of COVID-19. The prisoner release will exclude critics of authoritarian President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who've been convicted of terrorism charges. In a statement, Amnesty International called for the release of all political prisoners, adding, quote, "Those convicted in unfair trials under Turkey's overly broad anti-terrorism laws are also now condemned to face the prospect of infection from this deadly disease." Unquote. In Ecuador, emergency workers have collected the remains of nearly 1,900 people from hospitals and homes in the city of Guayaquil over the past 2 weeks. The deaths represent a 5-fold increase in Guayaquil's usual mortality rate, as hospitals are overwhelmed with hundreds of COVID-19 patients. In Brazil, a study's found the number of coronavirus cases in the country is likely 12 times higher than government figures, and that only 8% of cases are being officially reported. Testing remains scarce in Brazil, and there are extremely long waits to confirm test results. In Guatemala, Health Minister Hugo Monroy on Tuesday blamed a spike in coronavirus cases on U.S. deportations, saying at least half of the people who've been recently deported have tested positive for COVID-19.
This is the situation. There are flights with Guatemalan citizens who have been deported from the United States and who are put on the planes, and they have fevers. And so once they arrived here, we automatically evaluate their health, immediately test them for COVID-19, and a lot of them have been testing positive.
China has approved clinical trials for 2 experimental vaccines against the novel coronavirus. Both Chinese research teams have skipped testing on laboratory animals and are fast-tracking tests on human subjects. In the United States, human trials of a vaccine candidate began in Washington state last month. Top scientists at the World Health Organization caution it will be at least a year before any vaccine becomes widely available. Meanwhile, South Dakota's Republican Governor Kristi Noem announced the first statewide trial of the anti-malarial drug hydroxychloroquine as a potential treatment for COVID-19. President Trump Tuesday once again touted the drug, as he's done repeatedly for weeks, even though there's no medical evidence it's an effective treatment. In Ohio, the head of a prison guards union says a 5th prisoner has died of COVID-19 at the Elkton Federal Correctional Institution, where 36 prisoners and 26 staff have tested positive. Elsewhere, Virginia, Maryland, South Carolina, Ohio, and Indiana have reported the first COVID-19 deaths of people in state prisons. A prisoner at the D.C. Central Detention Facility died of the disease Monday, and at the Rikers Island Jail here in New York, a 2nd prisoner has died of COVID-19. In Michigan, where at least 10 incarcerated people have died, prisoners have filed a federal lawsuit alleging they've been given a death sentence. In New York, viral videos show a group of police officers in a Harlem subway station forcibly detaining a young boy for selling candy at the subway station in an alleged violation of social distancing rules. Police officers are also seen pulling the boy's sweater and holding him by the chest as he cries and struggles to get away from the officers. The boy's mother was reportedly present during the incident. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, police officers were filmed violently pulling out a man from inside a bus because the man was not wearing a face mask. In campaign news, former President Barack Obama Tuesday endorsed his former running mate, Joe Biden, for president, with an appeal to Senator Bernie Sanders supporters.
If I were running today, I wouldn't run the same race or have the same platform as I did in 2008. The world is different. There's too much unfinished business for us to just look backwards. We have to look to the future. Bernie understands that. And Joe understands that.
Obama's presidential endorsement came one day after Senator Sanders backed Joe Biden's bid for the White House, calling President Trump the most dangerous president in modern history of the United States. And Ohio Governor Mike DeWine has delayed 3 upcoming executions, saying the state has struggled for years to obtain a new combination of lethal injection drugs. This is the 8th time DeWine has delayed an execution since he took office in 2019. Last year, a federal judge ruled the lethal injection drugs that have been used in Ohio are unconstitutional and produced a painful drowning sensation similar to waterboarding. That ruling was later overturned by an appeals court. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the epicenter of the pandemic, New York City. As the death rate from the coronavirus pandemic continues to accelerate, with more than 2 million confirmed infections worldwide and at least 127,000 deaths, President Trump said Tuesday he would cut off U.S. support for the World Health Organization. Speaking from the Rose Garden, Trump sought to shift blame for his administration's disastrous handling of the pandemic onto the UN Public Health Agency, accusing the WHO of helping China to cover up the spread of the coronavirus when it emerged late last year.
The world depends on the WHO to work with countries to ensure that accurate information about international health threats is shared in a timely manner. And if it's not, to independently tell the world the truth about what is happening. The WHO failed in this basic duty and must be held accountable.
Trump's decision sparked international outrage and condemnation. Richard Horton, editor-in-chief of the Lancet Medical Journal, tweeted, "President Trump's decision to defund WHO is simply this, a crime against humanity. Every scientist, every health worker, every citizen must resist and rebel against this appalling betrayal of global solidarity." The American Medical Association's president, Patrice Harris, called on Trump to reconsider the cut, saying, quote, "Fighting a global pandemic requires international cooperation and reliance on science and data," she said. The global anti-poverty organization, Oxfam America, said the cut slash, quote, "any hopes for the responsible international cooperation and solidarity that's critical to save lives and restore the global economy." This comes as a new Oxfam report estimates the pandemic's economic fallout could push more than 500 million more people into poverty. For nearly 3 billion people already living in poverty and facing malnutrition, the virus could be deadly. In all, it estimates half of the world's 7.8 billion people could be living in poverty in the virus's aftermath. The report's called Dignity, Not Destitution, an economic rescue plan for all, to tackle the coronavirus crisis and rebuild a more equal world. For more, we're joined by Oxfam America's Vice President, Paul O'Brien. Welcome to Democracy Now! Let's begin with President Trump. In the midst of this pandemic, where the U.S. is the epicenter of the world's pandemic, more deaths than any other country in the world, President Trump announces he's ending support for the World Health Organization. Paul O'Brien, your response.
Thanks for having me on. It was pretty shocking to hear that last night. We had predicted last week that the number of deaths from coronavirus could be as high as 40 million over the coming period. So we're already in crisis, but it could get significantly worse. President Trump has his Treasury Secretary talking to other G20 finance ministers today. And what that leader needs to be able to show is America's role in leading multilateral cooperation. And at the same time, he's announcing that he's going to cut the legs off the World Health Organization, thereby undermining his own attempt to show global leadership. It was profoundly self-destructive for U.S. leadership. It's profoundly harmful for our world, and it seems to be nothing other than short-term blame shifting and scapegoating in order to distract people from the failures of this administration to properly lead on the issue. But its consequences could be devastating for people.
Paul O'Brien, there are many critics of the World Health Organization, but across the board now, with President Trump announcing that he is cutting the funding for this organization, the U.S., the largest funder of the World Health Organization, explain what this organization does and why it is so critical. And with President Trump so deeply concerned about what's happening in the United States, one would think why what happens in the rest of the world makes an enormous difference to what will happen in this country.
Well, as you say, New York is the epicenter of the crisis. The U.S. is now facing more deaths per day than has been seen. We are facing our own health crisis here. We're also facing our own economic crisis here. Just at the same time, you've got 17 million new unemployed in the United States. And even before this crisis started, you had 40% of Americans didn't have $400 to their name for an emergency, and then the crisis hits. So you've got a health crisis and an economic crisis here. You've got that in many ways even worse in many of the communities that Oxfam works in. We work in 90 countries around the world, including the United States. But you've got this health and economic crisis coming at the same time. You've got a World Health Organization whose job it is to convene leaders to make sure that the response is coordinated and evidence-based, is based on science, and that there is a truly global response to a global pandemic. So apart from the financing of the organization, the leadership and the moral authority of the organization to be able to drive global consensus to respond to this health and economic crisis is absolutely critical. And for President Trump, the world's most powerful politician, to stand on a stage yesterday for whatever reason he had, and to attack them in order to blame shift, undermines their ability to get that global consensus at a critical time. So this act in itself could have profound repercussions for many of the people that we see as particularly vulnerable in the United States and around the world.
He made the announcement in the Rose Garden yesterday, the highest one-day death toll for any nation in the world. 2,228 people died of COVID-19. That's the United States. Talk about the rest of the world where perhaps where COVID-19 hasn't hit as hard yet, mainly, for example, in Africa, and what the World Health Organization means, particularly for these areas of the world, the most vulnerable.
Right. Well, the whole world is vulnerable. We think particularly when you look at the combination of bad health systems or weak health systems and economic vulnerability, three areas are at greatest risk: Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East. You've got, in our report, found that we think 500 million more people could go into poverty as a consequence of this, essentially wiping out all the progress that's been made over the last 30 years in some contexts, and on average, the last 10 years of progress. Women are going to be, as is so often the case, facing the brunt of much of the consequences of this. In Bangladesh, for example, 1 million garment workers were laid off from their jobs. 80% of them are women. In Kenya, flour factories just shut down. 30,000 people sent home. Most of them are women. We don't have enough protections in the United States because we haven't addressed the problems of chronic extreme inequality. But when you look at what's going on outside of the United States, where 80% of the people of the workers on the planet Earth have no health insurance, 2 billion people are in the informal economy. So if you're in a context, let me just raise 5 contexts for you. These are the 5 largest slums in the world. There are slums in Karachi and Mumbai in Asia, in Cape Town and in Nairobi, in Kenya, and in Mexico City. Those 5, they're the largest single slums in larger cities, have 5.7 million people. When coronavirus hits those environments, first, there's no healthcare system in those contexts that's got ventilators waiting for them. In some countries where we work, there are literally 2 or 3 ventilators in the whole country. But economically, people are living in close quarters. There's no physical distancing possible. They get no sick pay. Their economies are being shut down. They're being told stay in place. They're not able to trade. They're not able to access goods. In many contexts, their borders are now not allowing food if they're net importing countries. So we have an economic crisis that is potentially coming along with a health crisis that is going to be profoundly harmful for many people and potentially destabilizing in ways that we will all face the consequences
Your
of.
report is called Dignity, Not Destitution, an economic rescue plan for all. You say Oxfam is calling for wealthy countries to agree to a global economic rescue package that includes canceling $1 trillion in debt payments for poorer countries. They say debt cancellation could free up to $400 billion to free up money to fight the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah, there are ways forward, and this is an incredibly important week, and today is an important day. You've got ministers of finance, the G20 is meeting, and ministers of finance from the 189 countries are meeting to ask and answer the question, what can they do collectively to address the economic fallout of this crisis? You reported what's going to happen to the global economy. We think there are three ways forward, and we're calling on these governments to work together to show the kind of multilateral leadership that President Trump failed to show last night. The first, as you mentioned, is debt. We've seen some early movement this week. Yesterday, we got some of the beginnings of good news in that the G7 supported some debt suspension, and the IMF agreed to a debt moratorium and put in place some debt relief packages for 25 countries. That's a start. It's nowhere near enough. What we don't want to see happen this year is that debt payments are essentially suspended in a moratorium, and where the interest will accrue and countries are going to be forced to pay that over the following years, even if they suspend it for 2020. Think of it this way. In 45 countries, their health systems are a quarter the size of the debt payments that they have to make. So they have to make 400% the size of their health budgets just in paying their debt allocations.
Oh, very quickly, I wanted to ask you about Yemen and Gaza.
From which perspectives? Both, because both of them are now facing both health and economic crisis. You've got in those contexts, and we work in both of those contexts with refugee populations and those who have been forcibly displaced to try and reduce the level of conflict. But as you know, I was in Gaza not long ago. People are living in incredibly constrained quarters. It's very dense. They have almost no economic activity at the best of times because of restrictions that are put on the environment. And when you put COVID into that context from an economic perspective, it creates potentially catastrophic levels of slowing down any form of economic activity. So we are deeply worried about both Yemen and Gaza. As I said earlier, we think that the Middle East is probably one of the fulcrums of concern for harm from this crisis.
Paul O'Brien, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to link to your report. Paul O'Brien is Vice President of Oxfam America. The new report, Dignity, Not Destitution, an Economic Rescue Plan for All to tackle the coronavirus crisis and rebuild a more equal world. When we come back, we look at coronavirus in Indian country. Stay with us.
Yeah. Follow the eagle, then honor my people. Turned up like the throttle in EQ, I'm conquering evil. Brought some pottery and offerings, walking my moccasins. Heads won't comment when you're doing good, but they'll mock your sins. Swallow your pride, forget the fame and glory. Respect those who came before me, check your creation stories. But whether my scalp's braided or now faded, I'm a proud native. My style is never outdated. Our ancestors laid it down for the foundation. The sound isn't downgraded, don't annihilate it. A little brown child, I was a loud mouth. Mixing up some powwow with some wild style.
Medicine by Christopher Mike Bitta, a Diné musician, also known as Defy. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. Democracy Now! The Quarantine Report, as we broadcast from the epicenter of the pandemic, New York City. We turn now to look at how the coronavirus is impacting Indian country. As the COVID-19 death toll continues to rise in the U.S., fear is mounting the spread of the virus could devastate tribal communities. Already, at least 44 people in the Indian health system have died. There are more than 1,100 confirmed cases, according to Indian country today. Navajo Nation, which stretches some 27,000 square miles across portions of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, has been hardest hit by the virus so far, with more than 830 reported cases and 28 deaths as of Tuesday. In Arizona, 16% of COVID-19 deaths have been Native Americans, who make up only 6% of the state's population. Meanwhile, two pueblos in New Mexico, Zia Pueblo and San Felipe, have some of the highest rates of infection in the United States. In Oklahoma, the first COVID-19-related death in the state was a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And experts warn these numbers will only grow due to a disproportionate number of pre-existing health conditions in tribal communities and resource-starved tribal health care systems ill-prepared for the pandemic. The coronavirus federal stimulus package provides $8 billion in relief for the 574 federally recognized tribes, but many say far more is needed to adequately protect Indigenous people from the virus's spread. For more, we're joined by a public health leader for American Indian and Alaska Native populations, epidemiologist Dean Seneca. He spent nearly 20 years as a senior health scientist for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. He's now executive director of Seneca Scientific Solutions. Plus, he's a citizen of the Seneca Nation. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Dean Seneca. Can you give us the lay of the land right now? How hard has the pandemic hit Indian country here in the U.S.?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. The pandemic... It's hit pretty hard in certain areas throughout Indian country. Like you said, that, Navajo Nation has definitely hit the hardest. And, some areas where we have high populations or cities where people can come together, we have a sparsity of cases, for example, in Portland, Oklahoma, and some other areas. But, overall, given the situation that Native people are in regarding health disparities and pre-existing conditions, except for Navajo Nation, I think, we're not doing that bad as far as the pandemic hitting Indian country. With just 12,000 tests only and over 1,100 confirmed, like you pointed out, many at Navajo Nation. The rest of the country is faring pretty well, in my opinion, given what the outbreak has done throughout the rest of the country. Now, having said that, my fear is that the virus hasn't really hit rural America yet. And as you know, many of our tribal nations throughout the country are in rural America. So that will be the big test. I feel that it will be a matter of time before we really see if the spread has hit into the deep pockets of Indian country.
I wanted to go to Navajo Nation for a minute, the largest tribal nation in the United States and the hardest hit by the coronavirus outbreak, with nearly 30 deaths and more than 830 confirmed cases as of Tuesday. Government and health officials, as well as community members, are scrambling to protect the roughly 175,000 people living on and around the reservation, as many residents still lack access to clean water and face the scarcity of other resources that are crucial to curb the spread of the deadly virus. I wanted to go to Navajo Council delegate Amber Crotty.
When you come back home to your remote area, you're surrounded by family and friends. And so that's where the contact also happens when you're in a household with multi-generational families, grandma's in the household with grandpa, then it's you, and then it's your children, and possibly if you have older children. And so it's multiple generations that are being hit, and that's what we're seeing. And the remoteness now, we can... As long as we're moving, the virus is moving with us. It's just shedding light on the disparities that have already existed, and also the lack of federal funding to meet the demand of the health needs.
Navajo Nation is currently on lockdown. Meanwhile, Navajo Nation President Jonathan Nez and Vice President Myron Leiser have quarantined themselves after learning they came in contact with someone who tested positive for COVID-19. Neither of them is currently presenting symptoms. I'd like to bring Navajo activist and artist Emma Robbins into the conversation with Dean Seneca. She's the director of the Navajo Water Project, a community-managed utility alternative that brings hot and cold running water to homes without access to water or sewer lines. Emma, welcome to Democracy Now! I wanted to ask you, if people were to say what's the number one rule all over the country right now, it's wash your hands and wash them well and often. Talk about Navajo Nation, how hard hit it is right now, and your access to water.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, Amy, for having me. As you mentioned, one of the hardest things right now is being able to wash your hands on the Navajo Nation. If you don't have hot and cold running water and access to soap, that's extremely difficult. And as we've all heard throughout the past weeks, that's one of the ways to flatten the curve the most. In addition to that, not having drinking water on the reservation is very difficult because when you need access to running water, you need to actually get bottled water and travel to these different grocery stores. And a lot of times when residents arrive, there just isn't any left.
And so talk about how hard hit Navajo Nation is right now.
Yeah, as mentioned, we're one of the hardest hit areas. Not only does our reservation have an extremely high infection rate, but those surrounding ours as well of the Pueblo nations do too. So it's very concentrated in one area. As you mentioned, there are over 800 cases of COVID on the Navajo Nation currently, and unfortunately, we've lost 28 community members.
Dean Seneca, if you can talk about the Trump administration's response to the pandemic in Indian country and overall, I mean, you for years worked you're an epidemiologist, you're a citizen of the Seneca Nation, and you work for the Centers for Disease Control, an agency that now everyone in this country has come to be familiar with.
As you can tell, right from the very beginning, I mean, he didn't make this pandemic a priority. He did a lot of mixed messaging in the very, very beginning when he started to talk about this. And you see that he's trying to now, in his recent reports, trying to justify that, no, we were on top of this right from the beginning. And that's far from the case. His mixed messaging is what was really critical. At times he would say, well, hey, this virus is just going to go away. And, we'll wake up one day and it won't be here. People listen to this information, and that is the wrong thing to send. He made a major mistake in eliminating his council on international health and global pandemics. That was huge right from the beginning. You should never have done this.
And explain, that was in the National Security Council. So when he's talking in, December about more money for bombs and building a wall, if that pandemic group were represented, they would have said, sir, what about China? Although it's clear very early on, the intelligence agencies, his closest cabinet members, heads of agencies, were actually warning him about this.
Yes, and he kind of put it aside, thinking that the pandemic would never leave China and reach the United States. And actually, one of the things that I predicted early, when I saw 20,000 cases in China, I said the virus is already here. And, and I said that, way before many of the experts. But here's the big thing. When I did the Ebola outbreak, I can say with certainty that the White House, CDC, FDA, and USDA were literally connected at the hip, okay? I think that's one of the big things that made us successful is that our communications were very, very tight, and we were working together and communicating several times a day. During this response, we know that the White House is, really, really struggling on who is in charge and who's overseeing this. At one time, it was CDC that was in charge. Then, they recently moved it to the FDA, so they were scrambling for leadership there. And, that speaks to poor leadership right from the top. I hate to say that. Being a veteran myself, a military person in the Army, Army Reserves, I don't ever want to see the United States fail. But I really do feel that, the administration really did not get on board in a timely manner when they needed to. That's evident. The leading expert from NIH has also pinpointed to that a little bit, and then he had to go back on TV recently to justify his hypothetical comments. Strong leadership right at the beginning of a pandemic like this is critical, is essential, because we're fighting a war. This is a war where you can't see the enemy. You don't know where the enemy is. The enemy can be around you at any time. And you have to do your best to protect yourself. This is a different kind of war. And in any kind of war and any kind of situation like this, you need strong leadership. And that's evident it did not happen.
Your perspective is an unusual one, Dean Seneca. You're there in Seneca Nation, upstate New York. You're a native epidemiologist, worked for the CDC for years. You took on Zika and H1N1. Explain the differences.
Well, this is the big difference is, those viruses really, they did hit the United States, but they never hit the United States hard. And we were able to do very effective contact tracing. And that's one thing I've been preaching throughout this whole pandemic is that contact tracing is the tool in which we can really stop and mitigate an outbreak. But, H1N1, we had a few cases here, something that we never saw before as a country. We ramped up our emergency operations components. We did see a couple deaths, and we did see a minor spread. And then after a while, it was another strain of the flu. Very, very different. It did give us an opportunity to kind of exercise our emergency preparedness capabilities. Zika, a little bit different. It did impact a little bit the southern part of the country, but not a major life-threatening situation with Zika. Not in all cases, but pretty much the southern border. A different kind of situation where it was a vector-borne virus that was transmitted, and it caused several different chronic conditions. The corona. Oh, yeah. Well, and Ebola. And I must say that Ebola was probably the hardest thing that I ever did in my life. When you go overseas and you have to prepare for something like Ebola, which is, a very violent kind of hemorrhagic fever where the body, when infected, literally bleeds internally. That was the hardest thing I ever did. Very dangerous situation. I went over there and I was part of a team of scientists. I'm proud to say they actually were a part of putting the curve into the ground. And what we did there is we went from passive episurveillance to active episurveillance to prospective, being active and getting out into the community and seeking cases ahead of time instead of people being sick and getting this information reported to us.
So, Dean Seneca, when you hear that President Trump is ending funding for the World Health Organization, what is your response?
This is a very irresponsible move on behalf of a leader that is leading the world in good public health and leading the world in almost every facet: economics, military, education, health. It's just really speechless at how irresponsible that move is. If anything, we should be trying to work with the WHO, which is such a very non-political, very, very passive, has a lot of empathy organization. It's a caring organization. They try to do their best with the limited resources they have, and they're all around the world.
And very, very quickly, Dean Seneca, for understanding how Indian country works, when a governor like Governor Cuomo declares, shelter at home, does that apply to the reservations in New York, or do you issue a separate order?
Well, what I've been promoting is that, we coordinate with our state and local and county health departments, but, tribal nations have the ultimate public health authority, and they need to exercise that public health authority when necessary. Given this situation, yes, we want our tribal nations to work with other state entities and those kinds of things in order to isolate and practice social distancing. And I know, for example, that Seneca Nation recently, President Armstrong issued a stay-at-home order, which is a very, very good thing to kind of, reduce the spread of this virus.
I wanted to go back to Emma for a moment. One of the things we've been focusing on Democracy Now! Are the mutual aid efforts that are going on all over. This is Kim Smith, a Navajo woman who's running a relief operation from a farm in Hogback, New Mexico.
We're stepping up for the community members at a time that is so crucial. And that's what we're here for, ultimately, as young people, to be able to sacrifice ourselves, sacrifice our well-being so that more of our people don't get sick. And the reality is that our ancestors sacrificed so much more for us to continue to be here.
So I wanted to go back now to Emma Robbins to talk about what is happening in Navajo country. You run the Navajo Water Project, as we said before, the mutual aid that's going on, and also why the Navajo community is so hard hit, a hot spot in not only in places like New Mexico and Arizona, but in Indian country overall.
Yeah, that's such a great question, because the Navajo Nation experiences some of the highest rates of water poverty in the United States. Navajos are 67 times more likely to not have indoor plumbing and potable water and sanitation in their homes. And again, getting back to the idea of not being able to wash your hands, you're not able to flatten the curve then. And we've seen a rise of COVID cases when that happens. As I mentioned, when people go out to haul water, whether that's from stores or watering points, they're also exposing themselves to others. I think it's also been really tough because we don't have a ton of health facilities across the reservation, and those that do have access to it often live very far away and aren't able to get there in time.
And can you talk about the role of Navajo women in leading mutual aid?
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked that question. I think I've seen many Navajo women step up and fight for our communities, which is our traditional role. That's not to say that we're in the 60s and it's the idea of stay in the kitchen. It's that we are the caretakers of our communities. And this is nothing new for us. It's time to step up and work together and just make it happen, where people are able to get the help that they need and to really just come back and serve our communities. I think of this as by Navajos, for Navajos, of projects that are happening on the reservation successfully.
And now the chairman of the Navajo Nation, Jonathan Nez, and the vice president, he's the president, currently in quarantine?
Yes, that's correct. They do believe that they could have come in contact with COVID themselves.
And the hospitals and clinics on the reservation, are they adequate? And what do you think needs to happen at the national level in the United States? We're talking stimulus package, the kind of aid that Indian country is getting from that it's obviously much more, $4-6 trillion stimulus package.
Yeah, so it's important to understand that on the Navajo Nation, we have two types of hospitals. One is IHS, or Indian Health Service, which is across Indian country. And then we have what are called 638 hospitals, which are hospitals that were originally part of the federal government, but have been taken over by the tribal government. And on the reservation, there are 16 health centers. 9 of those are clinics, 7 are hospitals. There are about 400 hospital beds across the nation and 46 ICU beds. Talking about these numbers, that is not proportionate at all. And it's scary to think about these numbers rising. And so, yes, we are a sovereign nation. Yes, we are able to help ourselves. But it's also important that we do have our treaties honored and have that funding from the federal government, because this is when we need help. Right now, we can't wait.
Well, Emma Robbins, I want to thank you so much for being with us, head of the Navajo Water Project. And I want to thank Dean Seneca, epidemiologist and citizen of the Seneca Nation, where he was speaking to us from in upstate New York. For years, he worked at the CDC, took on H1N1, took on Zika, took on Ebola, now dealing with this century's most significant, hardest-hitting pandemic of all, the coronavirus. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, why was an African-American doctor wearing a mask, getting together his equipment to test homeless people in Miami, Florida, handcuffed? Stay with us.
All around me are familiar faces, worn out places, worn out faces, threatened early for their daily races, going nowhere, and their tears are filling up their glasses. No expression. Have my head, I want to drown my sorrow. No tomorrow. And I find it kind of funny, I find it kind of sad. The dreams in which I'm dying are the best I've ever had. I find it hard to tell you, 'cause I find it hard to take. When people run in circles, it's a very, very mad world.
Tears for Fears frontman Kurt Smith and his daughter Diva giving a quarantine performance of the band's song Mad World. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the epicenter of the pandemic, New York City, but we're going to end today's show in Florida, where the Miami Police Department is under fire after a video surfaced of an officer handcuffing and detaining an African-American doctor outside his home on Friday. The man, Armin Anderson, was wearing a mask and preparing for a volunteer shift, helping protect homeless people from the spread of COVID-19 when a patrol car pulled up to his home. Surveillance video from Dr. Henderson's house shows him loading a van with supplies before the encounter. Dr. Henderson says the police officer handcuffed him after accusing him of littering and then asking for identification, which Henderson did not have on him. The officer was not wearing a mask. Dr. Henderson was. He had to yell to his wife inside their home to present identification before the officer finally released him. On Saturday, Miami Police Chief has ordered an internal investigation into the incident. The officer involved has not been identified. The encounter sparked widespread outrage and comes as African-American men report fears of increased racial profiling when they're following the CDC's suggestion that people wear masks in public. For more, we go to Miami to speak with Dr. Armin Henderson, an internal medicine physician, assistant professor of medicine at the University of Miami, also an organizer with Dream Defenders. He was recently profiled by the Miami Herald. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Dr. Henderson. Tell us in your own words what you were doing on Friday, and then what happened.
Yeah, so I was pretty much just putting tents in my car, and I was loading other supplies into my van, and, while I was doing that, I noticed that the police officer rode down the street, that a cross-section of my block, one way, really slow, and then he came back around the street the other way and basically turned down my block. And he pulled up next to me, questioning me if I lived there, if I worked here. I told him that I lived there. I told him what I was doing. I told him that, where I was putting the boxes was where the city of Miami comes to pick up our trash every week. For example, they're here this week, and people on my block are putting trash in the same place that I put the boxes, on Friday. And he just, at some point, he just didn't believe what I was saying, or he thought that I was being disrespectful, and decided to get out of the car and escalate the situation. Once he got out of the car, go ahead.
Keep going.
Once he got out of the car, he asked me for ID, which I said I didn't have. And, I was trying my best to keep cool during the situation and, remain steadfast on what I was doing, which was to be, at downtown Miami delivering food and tents to homeless individuals that live downtown. And so I pretty much went ahead and continued to do what I was going to do, because I didn't know where this encounter was going. And then he just decided to put cuffs on me, basically. Once he put cuffs on me, I called for my wife. She came out and pretty much de-escalated the situation. But even before she came, he was like inches from my face, basically yelling that I should call him Sergeant, I should call him Sir, and with no mask on. He had no gloves on. I could feel his saliva on my lips. It was just a crazy encounter.
I mean, this is such a horrific situation. It reminded me so much of Professor Henry Louis Gates of Harvard, who was on his front porch when the police came and challenged him and arrested him, came into his house. So you're wearing a mask. The police officer is not wearing a mask or gloves, and he then handcuffs you. What ultimately led him to release you?
So, I mean, I pretty much, while he was in my face, I pretty much kept quiet, and I was just waiting for my wife to come, basically. Once she came outside, she basically, asked why, I was in handcuffs, and she said that we live here, and he said, well, I'm going to need to see some ID. Go get it for me. And so she went in the house, got her ID, showed him that we actually lived here, and at that point, he pretty much just let me go.
I mean, this is astounding. Are you satisfied with the police department's response? And then, Dr. Henderson, if you can talk about, I mean, this is why the Miami Herald had profiled you before. I mean, a number of people have done pieces on you. You have been working with the homeless, giving all kinds of mutual aid, and also have been testing them for COVID-19. If you can talk about your work and then what you want of the Miami Police Department.
Well, I mean, firstly, I want the officer held accountable. It's no way that you racially profile me and then you arrest me, you detain me, and then during a pandemic where you have no mask on, where hundreds of police officers throughout Miami-Dade County have tested positive, and you're up in my face, spitting on my lips when we're supposed to be practicing social distancing. He just broke a number of protocols. And violated my rights. So firstly, I want him held accountable, and I want an apology as well. But outside of that, I think the bigger picture is that I was going to serve homeless individuals throughout Miami-Dade County that basically, the city has said, and cities across the United States have said the same thing, where we have to shelter in place, we have to socially distance. And for someone who doesn't have a house, for someone who lives unsheltered, it's very impossible to do those things. And in a pandemic, these are the most vulnerable individuals. These are the individuals who we're supposed to be paying the most attention to because, these are the individuals that sleep on buses, on bus stops, on benches. And they, because of that, when you're talking about public health response to a pandemic, you have to focus on those individuals who are using the public spaces the most.
And can you talk about you testing them and the response of unhoused people to you testing them?
Right. So, it's been hard to get testing, if you're not a basketball player, if you're not a rich person. And so literally we just been going out and first of all, we did a survey of individuals to see what their symptoms are, and we identified people who needed to be tested. But then, because we are the epicenter of the epidemic, and this is the most vulnerable population, I just figured that we should be testing people at random as well to sample population sizes to see how far, this virus has spread already. And honestly, though, this is supposed to be the city and the county's job in doing this, in providing necessities and testing individuals that are in this vulnerable population. And I think it just speaks to the fact that I even have to do this. It shouldn't be my job to volunteer out there to make sure that homeless individuals are cared for, especially in a pandemic. So at the surface, it feels like a feel-good story, but it's really not.
Well, Dr. Armin Henderson, I want to ask if you can stay with us for a few more minutes. We're going to continue our conversation about your work with the unhoused and your detention. Dr. Armin Henderson, internal medicine physician, assistant professor of medicine at the University of Miami, handcuffed by the Miami police. I'm Amy Goodman. We'll put part 2 at democracynow.org.